Only $3,200 a month for a warehouse to store the elderly? That was the price Clyde intended to pay for his mother-in-law's lifetime of sacrifice. But Ruby was an architect, and she had just designed a perfect plan to turn their betrayal into a financial collapse they could not recover from. Hello, everyone. I'm Casey. Today, I'm going to tell you about Ruby Perkins, a woman who used her architectural mind to redraw the boundaries of family. Let us step into Ruby's story together and see how sometimes silence is the most powerful way to protect your own dignity. The morning in my suburban home outside Asheville is so quiet that I can actually hear the steady thrum of my own heart beneath my thin wool sweater. Pale November sunlight filters through the living room windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air of a space I have spent half my life perfecting. I still wake up at 6 sharp every morning. Decades as an architect taught me that a mind without a schedule is a mind that rusts, and I refuse to let myself grow dull. I brewed a pot of black coffee today, hoping the rich, dark aroma would bring some sense of peace. But it only seemed to make the surrounding emptiness feel more substantial. My phone sits on the granite kitchen island, its screen dark and indifferent. There has not been a single text from Elma, even though she knows I spent all of last week fighting off a stubborn chest cold. A soft, rhythmic knock at the door broke the silence. It was Marcus, the young man from across the street. He was holding a small tray of warm pumpkin bread, the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg cutting through my gloom. He asked if I was already prepping for Thanksgiving, and gave me a smile that felt more genuine than any greeting I have received from my son-in-law Clyde in years. Marcus has no blood tie to me, yet he is the one who remembers my favorite tea and stops by whenever he sees me sitting alone on the porch. That small spark of kindness from a stranger brought a lump to my throat, a strange, warm comfort mixed with a sharp ache when I thought of my own flesh and blood. I invited Marcus in for tea, but my mind was stuck in yesterday evening. Clyde and Elma had stopped by to discuss the family dinner. I was in the kitchen, dicing onions for the turkey stuffing, when I heard Clyde's voice drifting in from the living room. He was whispering to Elma in that cold, calculating tone he uses for construction bids. He told her this house was far too large for a confused old woman, and that Sunset Gardens only cost $3,200 a month. He even suggested his own parents could move in here by Christmas. Every word felt like a needle under my skin. But it was Elma, my daughter, the girl I stayed up with through every fever and heartbreak, who truly broke me. She just stayed silent. That silence, that quiet agreement, was more agonizing than an open betrayal. I looked down at my hands and saw the wrinkles of time trembling uncontrollably. The 2 empty chairs I had already set at the table for our family dinner suddenly looked like a cruel joke. I realized then that I am no longer the heart of this home. To them, I am just an obstacle to be cleared away. Marcus left a long time ago, leaving me alone with a kitchen full of food for a Thanksgiving I no longer know how to face. Clyde's whispers continued to echo in my mind like a toxic virus, refusing to let me go. I set the paring knife down on the counter, my thin, bony hands trembling, not from the frailty of age, but from pure, unadulterated shock. I walked slowly toward the worn leather armchair in my library, the one that faces the window, looking out toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. On the side table sits our family photo album, its brown leather edges scuffed and peeling. I need to look back now, not to find comfort, but to witness exactly how blind my heart has been to the cracks that have been widening for years. I flip through the pages, and the pain begins to take shape through the events where Elma and Clyde were nowhere to be found. I remember my 65th birthday, a milestone I had looked forward to, imagining a warm family dinner in the dining room I designed myself. Instead, Elma sent a dry, impersonal floral arrangement with a text message saying she was too busy with a corporate gala for Clyde's firm and that I should enjoy myself. I spent that evening alone with a small grocery store cupcake until Mr. Jenkins, the mailman, stopped by. He saw my lights on late and brought me a small potted jasmine plant because he knew I loved the scent. A man who delivers my bills showed more care for my spirit than my own daughter. Then there was last year, when I had my knee surgery. I lay in that recovery room, my eyes aching from watching the door, hoping for a glimpse of Elma. All I got was a rushed, distracted call from Clyde, saying they were vacationing in Florida and simply couldn't make it back in time. The person who sat in that waiting room for 4 hours, the person who drove me home and cooked me a warm bowl of soup every night during that first difficult week, was Marcus. Clyde always referred to him as that kid with too much time on his hands. It is a bitter pill to swallow, realizing a stranger was there when I was at my most vulnerable, while my own flesh and blood were busy soaking up the southern sun. Looking closer at these memories, I see a sickening pattern. Clyde only appears with a polished smile when he needs my signature for what he calls tax optimization, or when he wants to brag to his colleagues about his mother-in-law, the once renowned architect. He turned me into a trophy for his career, a piece of prestige to be displayed, only to decide I should be tossed into a Sunset Gardens warehouse the moment my image no longer served him. I even remember the time he brought his parents, the Porters, over for dinner. He dismissed the slow-cooked stew I had spent all day preparing, ordering fast food instead because he claimed my tastes were outdated. It was painful to watch him be so gallant with Lydia, pulling out her chair and serving her, while he left me to struggle with my bad leg in the kitchen. His kindness is a mask, a custom-designed facade that was never intended for me. I slammed the album shut. A single question bores into my soul. Why did Marcus, a stranger, treat me like family, while Elma and Clyde treated me like a stranger to be liquidated? The truth is as cold and naked as a North Carolina frost. I am no longer a mother to them. I am an asset attached to a deed they are desperate to get their hands on. The sharp ache in my chest begins to settle into a terrifyingly clear state of mind. I will no longer lie to myself with excuses about them being busy or young. If they have chosen to view me as a burden to be cleared away, then I will show them exactly how decisive an architect can be when it is time to tear down a flawed design. This realization brings no tears. It brings a blueprint. The next morning, I woke up not to the harsh ring of my telephone, but to the cheerful trill of a finch outside my bedroom window. After that long night of finally seeing Elma and Clyde for who they truly are, a strange new feeling took hold of me. Relief. I no longer had to live in that state of quiet desperation, waiting for a call that would never come, or twisting myself into the shape of a submissive grandmother just to appease my son-in-law. I stepped out into the garden, pulling the crisp morning air of Asheville deep into my lungs, and felt the weight of 1,000 pounds simply lift off my shoulders. It was the first time in years I did not feel like a burden to be managed, but like a woman who owned the ground she stood on. Instead of retreating to a lonely kitchen, I decided to do something I had put off for far too long. I baked a batch of oatmeal cookies, using the secret recipe my mother taught me, and the warm scent of cinnamon and butter soon filled every corner of the house. I took them over to Marcus and knocked on his door. He looked surprised, then gave me a radiant smile and invited me to sit on his porch. We sat there as the morning sun danced on our porcelain cups, talking about my old architectural blueprints and his passion for local gardening. Marcus listened to me with genuine respect, without the impatient eye-rolling or the condescending tone I had grown so used to from Clyde. I realized then that if I just opened my heart, this world still had a place for me that had nothing to do with my bank account or my deed. Later that afternoon, I visited the Asheville Community Center, a place where I had actually helped design the landscaping a decade ago. I signed up for a painting class and joined a volunteer group that helps children with their reading. Sitting there among people my own age, hearing them share stories of the trips they have taken and the heartaches they have survived, I finally felt the walls of my isolation crumble. I saw that life was still vibrant and full of color, and that I had spent too long hiding behind the illusions of hope for children who chose not to care. When I returned home and caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, I saw a different Ruby, a woman with a spark in her eyes that loneliness had almost extinguished. I understood that family is not just about a shared name or bloodline. It is about the people who choose to stay, who value your presence, and who offer you peace. I started clearing out the living room, not to make space for Clyde's parents, but to create a home for the new friends who actually want to be there. A sweet sense of freedom has taken hold of me, and I am no longer waiting for love. I am building it myself. Have you ever realized that a stranger can understand and care for you more than your own family? How do you define a true family? Blood ties or genuine presence when you need it most? Please share your thoughts with Casey in the comments below. I'd love to hear yours. That sense of freedom I found at the Asheville Community Center felt like a low-voltage current running through my old bones, a quiet reminder that I still had value beyond the walls of this house. But I knew in my gut that this peace was just the eye of the storm. Elma and Clyde are like predators in that sense. They have a keen instinct for any shift in the air that might threaten their hold on me, or, more accurately, their hold on this property. I sat by the living room window, sipping a cup of herbal tea and watching the driveway. When I saw the familiar silver glint of Elma's car turning onto the gravel path, my heart gave a nervous thump against my ribs. I took a slow, deep breath, pushing the anxiety down into my chest and preparing myself for the first real test of my resolve. I had to play the part of the frail old woman just a little longer while I tightened the strings of my own plan. Elma let herself in without knocking, the front door clicking shut with the finality that always used to make me feel small. She was carrying a small mesh bag of oranges, the kind she knows I rarely eat because the acid bothers my stomach. But she brings them anyway, so she can feel like she's checking a box. She didn't say hello properly. Instead, her eyes immediately began a restless sweep of the room, like a forensic investigator looking for a disturbance in the scene. Her gaze snagged on Marcus's cookie tray, still sitting on the coffee table, a few crumbs of oatmeal and cinnamon left as evidence of a pleasant afternoon. She asked me who had been over, her voice sharp with a suspicion she didn't bother to hide, noting that there was an unfamiliar car parked across the street. I took my time removing my reading glasses, making every movement slow and deliberate to mask the adrenaline humming in my fingertips. I told her calmly that it was just Marcus, the new neighbor, who had stopped by to help me with some leaky faucets in the kitchen. I watched her eyebrows shoot up, a clear sign of the insecurity blooming behind her eyes. She dropped the oranges on the table with a dull thud and sat across from me, her fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles were white. She started lecturing me about being careful, telling me the world is full of strangers looking to take advantage of lonely seniors. It was almost laughable, hearing her warn me about strangers, when it was my own family standing in the room, measuring my floor plan for their own gain. Right then, Elma's phone began to buzz on the table. It was Clyde. She put him on speakerphone without asking, and his voice filled the quiet room, deep, resonant, and dripping with that forced authority he uses when he wants to bulldoze a conversation. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told me Elma had mentioned I was socializing with people he didn't know, and asked if I had any idea how much they worried about me. Then came the guilt, the heavy, familiar blanket he tries to wrap around my neck. He reminded me how hard he had worked to find a safe place like Sunset Gardens, where I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance, and he suggested that my friendship with a neighbor was an insult to the care they were trying to provide. I looked at the phone on the table, seeing the emotional trap they were setting with such practiced ease. Clyde kept going, telling me that if the neighbors saw me taking help from strangers, they would think my own children were neglecting me. He said I was embarrassing the family name. Elma reached out then, trying to take my hand in hers, a gesture that used to feel like comfort, but now felt like a cold set of shackles. They were trying to isolate me again, to make me feel so ashamed of my own independence that I would crawl back into the silence they had built for me. They wanted me to believe that my only safety lay in the cage they were designing. I pulled my hand back. It was a small movement, but Elma froze, as if I had struck her. I looked my daughter straight in the eyes, stripping away the mask of the confused, compliant mother she thought she knew. I told them both, in a voice that was steadier than I ever imagined it could be, that I appreciated their concern, but that I am 67 years old and perfectly capable of choosing my own friends. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. I could practically hear Clyde's brain stalling on the other end of the line, and Elma's mouth hung open in genuine shock. I didn't stop there. I told them that Marcus was a good man who had given me more of his time in a single afternoon than they had given me in the last month. I made it clear that I wasn't embarrassing anyone. I was simply living my life. I told them that from now on, I expected them to respect my privacy and the people I chose to let into my home. It was the first hard line I had drawn in years, a steel-reinforced boundary that told them Ruby Perkins was no longer a piece of property to be managed with a few cheap words of guilt. Elma stammered for a second, trying to find a way to flip the script back in her favor, but Clyde just hung up without another word. The line went dead with a sharp beep. Elma stood up quickly, mumbling something about a late meeting, and practically fled the house, leaving that bag of sour oranges behind on the table. I stood by the window and watched her car pull away, feeling a massive surge of confidence blooming in my chest. I had won the first round. I didn't feel the usual pang of regret, or the urge to call her back and apologize for having a backbone. My dignity, which they had spent years trying to erode, was starting to solidify again. I looked across the street and saw Marcus waving from his porch, and I couldn't help but smile. I had real allies now, and more importantly, I had my own voice back. The blueprint for my future was officially moving into the construction phase, and it was going to be more resilient than anything I had ever built before. The silence following my standoff with Elma did not feel like peace. It felt heavy, like the thick, stifling air before a massive Appalachian storm rolls over the ridges. I sat in my library, my fingers tracing the edge of an old blueprint, my ears straining for every sound from the gravel road. I knew Clyde. He was not a man to let a prize slip away quietly. As I expected, the roar of a high-end luxury SUV, a vehicle he pays for with Elma's salary, shattered the quiet afternoon. Clyde did not bother knocking. He shoved the oak front door open with such force it slammed against the wall with a sharp, dry crack. He marched inside without removing his shoes, grinding mud into the wool rug I had just vacuumed. He was not carrying a peace offering. He was clutching an industrial metal tape measure. He walked straight into my kitchen and started snapping the tape against the cabinets. The screech of metal on metal was unbearable. I stood in the doorway, my voice trembling with the weight of the insult, and asked him what on earth he was doing in my home. He turned toward me, his eyes bloodshot with pure calculation. He laughed and told me the house was far too big for one old woman. He said his own parents were paying $3,000 a month for a cramped city apartment, while I was wasting space on dusty memories. He stepped toward me, his breath smelling of cigarettes and arrogance. He told me he had already discussed it with Elma. They were going to tear down the kitchen wall to create an open floor plan for his parents to move in next month. He told me I would have a small room at Sunset Gardens where people would manage my meals and medication. He told me not to be stubborn because I did not have the strength to manage a deed anymore. Every word was designed to strip away the last bit of my dignity. He did not see me as a mother-in-law. He saw me as a hurdle to be cleared so his parents could live for free on 40 years of my hard work and sacrifice. "Get out of my house!" It was a sound I did not even recognize as my own, a raw burst of defiance that came from my very soul. Clyde froze for a split second. Then he gave me a condescending, hateful smirk. He asked me what I planned to do. Call the police? He mocked the idea of them seeing a senile, panicked old woman. He reminded me that Elma was the sole heir, and that sooner or later, this place belonged to them anyway. He threw the tape measure onto the granite island. The clatter was deafening, a final punctuation mark on our relationship. When he finally walked out, leaving me shaking in my cold kitchen, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. But deep inside, the anger had already hardened into a block of cold steel. I looked at the kitchen wall where I had marked Elma's height every year, and I realized I had to protect it. I would either save this house, or I would tear it down on my own terms before I let them touch it. There was no going back now. The heavy vibration from Clyde slamming the front door still echoed in my chest, but the trembling was no longer born of fear. It was the activation of an old instinct, one that had lain dormant since the day I laid down my last set of blueprints and stepped into retirement. In the shadows of my violated kitchen, I realized a fundamental truth that every architect knows. A structure hollowed out by rot from the inside cannot be restored. It can only be dismantled and rebuilt on fresh ground. I did not stand there weeping for the memories they had trampled upon. Instead, I reached for my leather-bound notebook, flicked on the warm yellow desk lamp, and began writing down the first set of numbers. This was not a design for a new residence. This was the master plan for my liberation. The first thing I did the following morning was not brew my usual tea, but head down to the basement to open my late husband's old floor safe. I pulled out the original deed to the house, a piece of parchment, yellowed at the edges, but possessing the strength of reinforced steel. I traced the ink of my signature and that of my husband. Clyde believed that because I was aging, I had forgotten that this house remained solely in my name. He thought that pathetic residency agreement he pressured me into signing with a shaky hand held some actual weight. As someone who had navigated hundreds of construction contracts, I knew it was nothing more than a scrap of paper without proper notarization or the true consent of the owner. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Miller, a veteran attorney from my generation who understood the value of a person's word and their property. His voice was warm and grounding as he confirmed that I still maintained 100% of the decision-making power over my assets. That sentence felt like the most solid foundation stone ever laid. I asked him to prepare the necessary documents to terminate any temporary residency rights I had previously suggested to my children in passing. I was not attacking anyone. I was simply reclaiming what belonged to me before they could steal it in the light of day. The next step required a delicate touch. I called Sarah, an old friend and the top real estate agent in Asheville. I invited her over under the guise of a quiet afternoon tea. When Sarah walked in, she surveyed the house with a professional's eye, noting the custom built-ins and the way I had oriented the windows to catch the mountain light. I didn't hide anything from her. I told her I wanted to sell the place quickly, quietly, and completely. Sarah took my hand, a deep understanding in her eyes, as she had seen far too many widows pushed into corners by their own children. We began to stage our plan. To avoid any suspicion from Elma, who had developed a habit of stopping by to check on her investment, we agreed there would be no sign in the yard. Everything would be handled through private listings, with showings scheduled only during the hours when Elma was busy at work or taking the kids to their lessons. Sarah helped me set the price. This house, with its prime location and the architecture I had personally crafted, was worth far more than the liquidation value Clyde was calculating to dump me into a managed care facility. To buy myself more time, I began to play the part of the compliant, aging mother who had finally accepted her fate. When Elma stopped by that weekend, she was surprised to find me stacking cardboard boxes in the hallway. She asked if I was clearing things out for Clyde's parents, her voice sounding relieved, but still sharp with calculation. I gave her a weak smile and a slow nod, telling her that Clyde was right and that I was getting too old to keep track of so many things. In reality, I was purging my life of everything that didn't serve my future. I began giving away my best kitchenware and gardening tools to Marcus, who helped me move the heavy boxes without asking a single prying question. I quietly moved my most precious mementos, my original vellum drawings, and the family photo albums to a secure, private storage unit I had rented across town. Every item that left the house felt like a tether being cut. Elma and Clyde watched the house grow emptier with a sense of triumph, thinking they were winning, never suspecting I was turning the house into a perfect, move-in-ready asset for the market. Over the next 2 weeks, my home welcomed a series of quiet visitors. They were people who truly appreciated the craft of the building and the peace of the lot. Every time Sarah brought a potential buyer through, I would sit on the porch with Marcus, pretending we were just two neighbors discussing the best way to overwinter our chrysanthemums. Marcus proved to be an incredible shield, always keeping a watchful eye on the road to see if Elma's silver SUV or Clyde's luxury car were approaching. One afternoon, a young doctor couple from Charlotte arrived. They fell in love with the kitchen and the way the 4 o'clock sun hit the living room floor. They offered a price above our expectations and committed to preserving the home's original structure. When I sat in Sarah's office and put my pen to the temporary sales agreement, I felt a surge of energy move through me. I was no longer a victim of family financial manipulation. I was the victor in the most important transaction of my life, the purchase of my own peace. That evening, I stood alone in the center of the living room, which had begun to feel spacious and light again. Clyde had called earlier, informing me in a patronizing tone that he was bringing a contractor by next week to measure for the wall demolition. He told me to get my things ready, because Sunset Gardens had a spot waiting for me. I simply murmured an agreement, no longer feeling the bite of his words. I looked at the house one last time as its owner. The earnest money was already sitting in a new account that only I and Mr. Miller knew existed. I had already found a beautiful little condo overlooking the lake, a place where no one could shove open the door without an invitation. My defense system was complete. The final ink on the plan for my new life was dry. Now, I just had to wait for the right moment to vanish right from under the noses of the greedy children who were busy counting the days until they could seize what they thought was theirs. My silence now was not surrender. It was the unwavering resolve of an architect waiting for the grand opening of her greatest work, her freedom. After that harrowing afternoon, when Clyde burst into my home with his industrial tape measure, I found myself sitting motionless in the shadows of my living room for hours. The house felt colder than usual, the silence ringing with the echoes of his threats and his greed. Even though the deposit from the sale was safely tucked away in a private bank account, my heart felt like a structure shaking violently after a seismic shock. I questioned whether I truly had the strength to walk this path alone, as this house, filled with 40 years of memories, suddenly felt far too vast and frightening for one woman to defend. But then, the familiar headlights of Marcus's old pickup truck swept across my windows, cutting through the dark fog of my thoughts. His knock on the door was not the frantic, demanding bang of my son-in-law. It was steady, gentle, and felt like a promise. I opened the door to find Marcus standing there with a small grocery bag and a thermos of tea. He didn't ask about the house or the money. He simply looked at me and asked if I was okay after seeing Clyde's car tear out of the driveway so quickly. I invited him in, and for the first time in a very long time, I allowed my exhaustion to show. We sat in the very kitchen where Clyde had just insulted my life's work, and Marcus poured me a cup of warm chamomile tea. He told me he knew exactly what was happening, and that I didn't need to explain a single detail to him. He said that I had spent my entire career designing sanctuaries for other people, and now it was time for me to have a construction crew for my own peace of mind. He told me that he and a few friends from the Asheville Community Center were ready to step in. Looking at him, my eyes grew misty, as the unsolicited kindness of this young neighbor felt like a soothing balm on the wounds my own daughter had left behind. The following morning, it wasn't just Marcus who showed up. A small group of 4 people from my painting club and the volunteer circle arrived at my doorstep. There was Martha, who had been a widow for years and understood the weight of a quiet house, and a young carpenter named Sam. They didn't come with tape measures to take things away or hammers to break walls down. They arrived with high-quality shipping cartons, heavy-duty tape, and smiles that actually reached their eyes. Martha hugged me and told me they were there to help me pack my most precious memories. We spent the entire afternoon carefully wrapping my heirloom china, the framed photos of my late husband, and the original vellum blueprints that were the heart of my professional legacy. They handled every item with such reverence, as if each small object were a sacred treasure. As we worked, we shared stories of our own lives, and I realized that while my own blood had betrayed me, life was compensating me with these sincere connections. Sam even offered to use his truck to move the most important boxes to my storage unit under the cover of night, ensuring Clyde's prying eyes wouldn't see a thing. We took a break among the neatly stacked boxes, and I served everyone simple turkey sandwiches and cranberry sauce. The sound of laughter and genuine conversation filled the rooms that had become so cold and hollow lately. I watched Marcus helping Sam move a small cabinet and saw Martha gently dusting the old grandfather clock. I couldn't help but wonder why I never received this kind of warmth or reliability from Elma. I realized then a truth that had come to me late in life. Family is not strictly defined by DNA or a shared name. Real family consists of the people who choose to show up when you are at your lowest point. People who don't see you as a financial burden or an asset to be managed, but as a soul worthy of respect. Marcus and these friends didn't owe me anything. They helped me because they valued who I was, not because of the deed to my property. That realization was bittersweet, but it gave me an incredible sense of power for the confrontation that was still to come. When the group finally left, Marcus lingered for a moment to double-check the locks on my doors. He told me he would be keeping an eye on the house the next day, and that if Clyde or anyone else showed up to cause trouble, I should call him immediately. He reminded me that I wasn't alone anymore. I took his hand and told him he had no idea how much his presence meant to me. Standing alone in my living room, which now looked more like a transition point than a permanent home, I didn't feel the old familiar fear. I had a plan. I had the financial means. And most importantly, I had real allies standing with me. I looked at the printed floor plan of my new lakefront condo. It was smaller than this house, but I knew it would be filled with truth and genuine affection. That night, for the first time in weeks, I fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, knowing that no matter how hard the coming storm blew, I wouldn't have to face it by myself. In the most difficult moments of your life, who was the person who reached out to help you? Have you ever found that a stranger was kinder and more loyal than your own family members? Please share the story of your own wonderful allies in the comments below, so we can all be reminded of the goodness that still exists in this world. The house felt larger and more hollow after Marcus and the others helped me clear out the first wave of my life. But even with the clutter gone, a heavy, cold unease continued to settle in my bones. The sale was moving forward, and my suitcases were standing ready by the door like silent sentinels. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I was missing a vital piece of the blueprint Clyde had drawn up for my future. It was one of those thick, foggy Asheville nights where the mist rolls off the mountains and clings to the window panes like a damp shroud, making the world outside feel distant and ghost-like. I wandered into my old home office, the place where Clyde had set up camp lately to handle his so-called business during his intrusive visits, hoping to find a few of my favorite drafting pens to take with me. In the dim light of the desk lamp, buried beneath a messy pile of invoices and construction bids he had carelessly left behind, I finally found the answer to every nagging doubt that had been keeping me awake. Clyde had always been blinded by his own arrogance, believing that a confused old woman like me would never dare to touch his belongings or look beneath the surface of his professional facade. As I began to clear the clutter to make room for the final trash bag, a navy blue folder with the sharp, clinical logo of a psychiatric clinic I did not recognize caught the light. Printed in bold, unforgiving letters on the side tab was my own name: Ruby Perkins, case file 8821. My hands began to tremble, not with the frailty of age, but with a sudden, sharp surge of adrenaline as I pulled the first page from the clip. It was not a bill or a contract, but a meticulously drafted psychological evaluation filled with cold, italicized phrases that claimed I was showing signs of early-onset dementia. The document asserted that I was frequently disoriented regarding time and space, and that I was fundamentally incapable of managing my own personal assets or making legal decisions. My heart nearly stopped in my chest as I realized they weren't just after the equity in my home. They were planning to turn me into a legal non-entity on paper. I turned the pages further, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts, as I discovered a printed chain of emails between Clyde and a lawyer who specialized in senior guardianship. On October 12th, Clyde had written to the attorney, stating that they needed to fast-track the guardianship process because his mother-in-law was starting to act stubborn and refuse to follow instructions. He wrote that if I were allowed to sell the house or move my money on my own, they would end up empty-handed. He asked if the contact at the psychiatric clinic had been reached, emphasizing that he needed a certification strong enough to convince a court to hand over all property management rights to Elma and himself. The reply from the lawyer was even more chilling, advising Clyde that they needed more physical evidence of my decline. The attorney told him to record every time I forgot to turn off the stove, any instance where I confused a name, or any moment of panic. And if those moments didn't happen naturally, he should find a way to create those situations. The lawyer concluded that once guardianship was secured, I would have no legal standing to oppose moving into Sunset Gardens, and all my bank accounts would be under Clyde's absolute control. Reading those words over and over, I felt a literal wave of cold air sweep down my spine as the reality of their medical gaslighting took hold. I suddenly understood why Elma was always asking me if I remembered what day it was, with that performative tilt of her head, and why Clyde had been sabotaging the faucets and then blaming me for forgetting to turn them off. It was a systematic campaign to erase my personhood so they could more easily strip me of my life's work. I sat back in my swivel chair, a deep, visceral disgust rising in my throat, as I realized the daughter I had taught to walk was now documenting my every step to prove I was a broken vessel. Elma had chosen to stand in Clyde's shadow, willing to trample her own mother's dignity in exchange for a free house and a false sense of financial security. The pain of this discovery was far sharper than hearing Clyde calculate the cost of a nursing home. It was the realization that they viewed me as nothing more than a profitable investment project to be liquidated when I no longer fit their design. The initial agony eventually settled into a state of freezing, crystalline clarity. I did not cry, because tears were a luxury that had no place in the new set of plans I was drawing up in my mind. I reached for my phone and carefully photographed every single page of those documents and every line of those emails, ensuring I had a digital record of their treachery to use as a shield if they ever tried to drag me before a judge. I knew that if I did not vanish immediately, the steel trap of this guardianship plot would snap shut around my neck, and I would never be heard from again. I called Mr. Miller right then, despite the late hour, my voice like iron, as I told him that I had found what they were hiding, and that they were trying to have me declared legally incompetent. Miller's voice turned grave as he warned me that I had to leave now, because once a petition was filed with the court, I would be walking into a legal nightmare that would be nearly impossible to escape. I stood up and looked around my office one last time, feeling no remaining attachment to the walls that had sheltered my family for 40 years. This place had been poisoned by the greed and the lies of the people I had called my own flesh and blood. I decided right then that I would not just sell the house and disappear into the night. I would leave them with a final, unexpected gift that they would never see coming. My final blueprint was complete, and it left absolutely no room for mercy or compromise. I am Ruby Perkins. I'm an architect, and I know exactly how to demolish a toxic structure to make room for a life that is clean, quiet, and entirely my own. After I folded away that disgusting collection of lies Clyde and Elma had spent so much energy creating, I felt like a building that had just endured a massive earthquake. My head was empty, and my breath came in short, jagged bursts. I needed a support, a foundation to cling to, before the whole structure of my life collapsed. In the dim light of my increasingly empty home, my feet led me toward the attic, the place that held the last lingering pieces of David, my late husband. I sat on the wooden floor and pulled an old cedar chest toward me. As the lid creaked open, the scent of pine and David's familiar aftershave drifted out, as gentle as a hug from the past. I pulled out the gray wool sweater he used to wear when we sat on the porch watching the fog settle over the Blue Ridge peaks. I pressed my face into the fabric, and for the first time in weeks, the tears actually came. Not from the shame they tried to push on me, but from the deep, aching longing for the one person who loved me without conditions. David had been a structural engineer, and he always told me that I should go ahead and draw the most beautiful dreams, because he would be the one to make sure they never fell down. We laid the first brick of this house together with love and the belief in an eternal sanctuary. If he knew that the daughter he once cradled in his arms was now trying to declare me insane just to seize his hard work, it would break his heart. But deep inside, I heard his whisper telling me that the house was just walls and that I was the most precious blueprint of all. He told me not to let him destroy me. I pulled out a roll of old vellum, the very first design for this house. At the bottom corner, there was David's handwriting. For Ruby, the woman who built my world. Looking at those words, a strange, powerful energy surged through me. I realized then that I was not weak or confused, no matter what lies Clyde tried to shove into my mind. I was the woman who had built a career alongside her husband, raised a child, and created things of lasting value. Elma's betrayal was a profound pain, but it did not define who I was. David had left me more than just property. He left me the belief in my own worth. I stood up and folded the sweater with care. I no longer felt backed into a corner. Instead, I felt as if I were standing on a new peak, looking down at their petty schemes with a sense of pride and grace. I walked to the window and looked out at the Asheville night. The moonlight was clear, illuminating the gravel path Marcus had helped me clear earlier. I understood then that David was no longer in these walls. He was in the steady resolve burning in my heart. This house had finished its mission as the vessel for our love for 40 years. Now, it needed to be released so I could carry David's spirit to a new place where truth and respect were the foundation. I was going to leave, not with hatred, but with freedom. The coming confrontation with Clyde and Elma was no longer a struggle over assets. It was a journey to protect the truth and the dignity David and I promised to uphold forever. I smiled, a quiet and decisive smile. The final drawings had been stamped and approved. Tomorrow, as the sun rises, Ruby Perkins will begin her greatest project, her own rebirth. Monday morning in Asheville arrived, draped in a fog so thick I could not even see the fence line of Marcus's yard across the street. After a long night sitting by David's old cedar chest, I felt my spirit had been scrubbed clean, leaving me as sharp and cold as a freshly honed blade. I knew they were coming. The instincts of an architect helped me sense the structural failure of a toxic relationship long before the collapse began. When the doorbell rang with a frantic, rhythmic persistence at 9 a.m, I did not flinch. I simply straightened the collar of my wool sweater and took a deep breath to fill my chest with resolve. As Casey often says, Sometimes you have to stand perfectly still in the eye of the storm to protect the only thing you truly own, which is your dignity. Elma walked in first, her face pale and pinched with a stress she couldn't hide, followed by Clyde, who wore a look of blatant, premature triumph. But it was the third man who caught my attention, a middle-aged professional in a gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing gold-rimmed glasses that framed a pair of cold, clinical eyes. Clyde introduced him as Dr. Sterling, a specialist in geriatric mental health, his voice dripping with a fake concern that made my stomach turn. He told me they just wanted to make sure I was doing all right after everything that had happened lately. They sat down in my living room, as if I had already ceased to exist as the homeowner. Clyde deliberately chose David's favorite armchair, a calculated provocation that I met with a steady gaze. Sterling opened his briefcase and pulled out a file and a fountain pen, asking if I would mind answering a few simple questions to assess my cognitive capacity. I looked into his eyes and immediately recognized the look of a man who had been bought and paid for by Clyde to sign my mental death warrant. The room suddenly felt cramped and suffocating, like a glass laboratory cage. Sterling started with the standard traps, asking if I knew what day it was or when I had last paid my utility bills. Clyde and Elma sat on either side of him, their eyes searching for even a second of hesitation they could record as evidence. I realized their strategy was to provoke my anger. If I screamed or threw them out in a fit of rage, Sterling would simply note that the patient was losing behavioral control and exhibiting signs of paranoia and aggression. They began mentioning things I had allegedly forgotten, things that had never happened in reality, Elma added in a voice that I surely remembered leaving the gas stove burning all night last week. It was a filthy attack on my self-confidence, designed to make me doubt my own memory and believe I truly was a confused old woman. I felt my heart racing and through my body, but I squeezed my hands tight, reminding myself of the liberation plan I had already finalized. I offered that made Sterling pause mid-sentence. I told him, with a voice as clear and structured as a zoning presentation, that today was Monday, November 10th. I explained that my electricity bill is automatically paid through my Chase account on the 5th of every month. And regarding the stove, I looked directly at Elma and reminded her that she knew perfectly well our home is equipped with an induction cooktop that has an automatic 30-minute shutoff. I noted that as an architect, I had personally overseen the installation of that system to ensure absolute safety. I pulled out my own tablet, showing them the digital bank statements and the detailed daily logs I had been keeping with meticulous care. I did not answer like an interrogated victim. I spoke like an auditor reviewing a construction project. Sterling began to look uneasy, glancing toward Clyde as his forehead started to bead with sweat. He that I seemed very organized, his clinical confidence wavering under the weight of my logic. I stood up, creating an invisible pressure that forced all three of them to look up at me. I told them that I was fully aware of case file 8821, a statement that acted like a bomb dropped in the center of the room. Clyde's face drained of color, turning from pale to a deep, angry red fueled by fear. Elma began to troll. I told Clyde that I had found the file and had already photographed every single email he had exchanged with that guardianship lawyer. I informed them that if they took one more step against my freedom, those documents would be sent directly to the medical board and the district attorney's office immediately. I walked to the front door and threw it wide open. I told Dr. Sterling the evaluation was over and informed Clyde and Elma that this was the last time they would ever set foot in my home without the presence of my legal counsel. A heavy silence swallowed the room. Clyde looked like he wanted to roar, but seeing my resolve and the evidence I held, he could only stomp out in a huff, dragging Elma behind him. When the door finally clicked shut, I leaned my back against it, my body feeling utterly spent. I had been backed into a corner, but I had not broken. I had used the truth to shatter their trap. The biggest battle had been won, and now it was time for the final leap into total freedom. The feeling of being betrayed and having your self-esteem hurt by the people you love most is an indescribable pain. Have you ever had to fight to defend your voice and the truth against the imposition of others? Please leave a comment sharing how you stood your ground. The heavy click of the front door when I finally closed it on Clyde and Elma's intrusive medical evaluation didn't just end a terrible afternoon. It marked the end of a 40-year chapter of my life. Standing in my foyer, looking at the polished oak floorboards I had personally selected when I was a young architect, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in decades. Casey was right when she said the truth would eventually set us free. And in that moment, I felt as if I were floating above the wreckage of my own family. Everything was in place. Marcus had spent the previous evening helping me move the last of my essential boxes into storage under the cover of a cool mountain night. The blueprint for my escape was finished, missing only the final stroke of a pen and a formal goodbye to the people who had traded their souls for my home's equity. I woke up before the sun hit the pines, the air in Asheville crisp and full of promise. I brewed one last pot of coffee in my kitchen, sitting on the porch to watch the pale light crawl over the Blue Ridge peaks while I gathered my thoughts. Just yesterday afternoon, in the quiet wood-paneled office of Mr. Miller, I had signed the final transfer of the house title. The funds from the young doctor couple who purchased the property had already cleared into my private account, a substantial balance that guaranteed my independence and a future without Clyde's permission. The empty spots on the walls where our family photos used to hang didn't feel like scars. They looked like clean white space on a fresh canvas. I dressed in my best suit, packed the single suitcase I had kept for myself, and sat at the dining table to wait. I knew Clyde would return. He couldn't stand the loss of control, and I was certain he would be clutching some scrap of legal paper from his compromised lawyer to try one last desperate maneuver. At 10 o'clock sharp, the familiar roar of that luxury SUV growled into my gravel driveway. He walked into my home with Elma, both of them wearing the stiff, grim expressions of people who believe they have already secured their victory. Clyde didn't even bother with a greeting. He just tossed a thick folder onto the table in front of me with a thud. He told me it was a petition for temporary guardianship they had filed with the court, and claimed that I no longer had the legal capacity to touch a single asset. He looked at me with the cold arrogance of a predator who thinks his prey is finally cornered. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my bag and pushed a heavy yellow gold envelope across the table toward them. I told them both, quite clearly, that they were always exactly one step behind me. I explained that the envelope contained an official eviction notice from the new owners of the property. I watched as the blood drained from Clyde's face while I told him the sale had been finalized and the money had been fully dispersed into my account 2 weeks before his lawyer even drafted that pathetic petition. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the sound of Clyde's ragged breathing. I watched his eyes bulge as he read the bold print of the real estate law firm's letterhead. The paper rattled in his hands, the sound of his greed finally meeting a wall it couldn't bulldoze. Elma collapsed into a nearby chair, her voice a hollow, gasping whisper. as she realized the house and the money were completely beyond their reach. She looked at me and asked what would happen to Clyde's parents, since they had already ended their own lease in anticipation of moving into my living room. I looked my daughter in the eye and told her I wasn't the one who had put them in this position. She and Clyde were the ones who pushed me out of my own life with their lies and medical traps. I stated that they had exactly 48 hours to clear their belongings out of this house before the new owners took legal possession. Clyde surged forward, his face red with a desperate, impotent rage. But then the front door opened, and Marcus's tall frame appeared in the doorway. He didn't say a word, but his silent presence acted as a solid, unmoving pillar that protected my final boundary. I stood up and picked up my suitcase, feeling no need for any more screams or tears. I looked at my daughter and her husband one last time with a strange sense of pity. They had chosen a house over a mother, and empty numbers over human dignity. I told them I truly hoped they found some kind of peace in the choices they had made, because they would have to live with them for the rest of their lives. I walked out the front door without looking back once. Marcus helped me place my bag in the car, and as we pulled away from the curb, I watched the house through the rearview mirror until it vanished into the Asheville trees. It wasn't my sanctuary anymore. It was just a finished project. Ahead of me was the open road leading toward the lake, where a quiet condo and a fresh set of plans were waiting for me. My greatest architectural achievement, the blueprint for a life of total independence and self-respect, was finally open for me to live in. 3 weeks after I walked away from the house I had designed with my own sweat and dreams, the first winter snow began to drift over Asheville. From the balcony of my new lakeside condo, I watched the water begin to glaze over with thin, crystalline sheets of ice. It was quiet here, a profound and healing silence that allowed me to hear my own thoughts for the first time in years. I had spent these weeks rediscovering the weight of a drafting pencil, sketching out new ideas for the local community center, and feeling the old passion for design flare back to life. But even in this newfound peace, I knew there was one final stroke needed to complete the blueprint of my life. I knew I had to face the wreckage one last time to ensure the foundation of my freedom was legally unshakable. I didn't reach for my old, comfortable wool sweater this morning. Instead, I chose my most powerful navy blue suit, the one I used to wear when I had to stand my ground in boardrooms full of skeptical contractors. I tied the silk scarf David had given me for our 30th anniversary around my neck, feeling its familiar softness like a reassuring touch from him. Today was the day of the guardianship hearing at the Buncombe County Courthouse. I wasn't going there to fight or to scream. I was going there to stand as a witness to the truth. The Buncombe County Justice Center stood tall with its massive white stone pillars, a neoclassical monument to the law that I had always admired from an architectural standpoint. As I stepped through the security scanners, I felt a steady, grounding confidence move from the heels of my shoes all the way to my soul. Mr. Miller was already waiting for me in the lobby, offering a sharp, encouraging nod. Marcus was there too, standing quietly in a corner. Seeing him, this man who was essentially a stranger just a few months ago, offered me more a sense of security than any promise of blood ever had. He wasn't there for a piece of my estate. He was there because he cared about a neighbor's dignity. Across the hallway, I saw Clyde and Alma. They looked utterly diminished. Clyde's expensive suit looked rumpled and ill-fitting, and the usual mask of arrogance had been replaced by a frantic, hollow-eyed desperation. Alma sat with her head down, her eyes red from crying. They were facing the harsh reality of their own making. They were homeless, buried in debt from their overextended lifestyle, and they were walking into a legal battle they were destined to lose. As we entered the courtroom, the smell of polished oak and old paper reminded me of my early days as an apprentice, a time when every measurement had to be precise and every plan had to be transparent. The hearing began in a state of heavy, ceremonial silence. Clyde, speaking through a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tried to cling to his original narrative. He argued that I was a vulnerable, isolated woman, showing clear signs of cognitive decline, and that a protective guardianship was necessary to prevent me from squandering my remaining assets. He spoke about the sale of the house as an irrational act of an unstable mind, painting my move to the condo as a sign that I could no longer care for myself. Then it was Miller's turn. He didn't use grand gestures or flowery language. He simply presented a series of undeniable facts. He showed the court my meticulously managed bank statements, the active design contracts I was still fulfilling, and the glowing character references from my colleagues at the architectural firm. But the room truly went still when he produced case file 8821. When Miller began reading the printed emails between Clyde and Dr. Sterling, detailing their plan to fabricate a dementia diagnosis, a low murmur of shock rippled through the gallery. I watched Judge Henderson, a woman with eyes as sharp as a diamond, furrow her brow in visible disgust as she read the lines where Clyde requested the creation of situations to make me look senile. The mask of filial piety they had tried to wear was stripped away, leaving nothing but the raw, ugly bones of their greed. Judge Henderson brought her gavel down, demanding absolute silence. She looked directly at Clyde and Elma, her voice echoing through the chamber like the voice of a long-suppressed conscience. She stated that in her 20 years on the bench, she had seen many family disputes, but rarely had she witnessed such a systematic and cruel abuse of familial trust. She told them that using the legal and medical systems to strip a mother of her freedom was not an act of care. It was an act of profound cruelty and severe financial abuse. She denied the guardianship petition with a finality that felt like a weight being lifted from the world. Furthermore, she formally reaffirmed my absolute autonomy over all my assets and personal decisions. The judge noted that I was not only perfectly lucid, but that I had shown a remarkable, sharp intellect in protecting myself from their malicious schemes. She also announced that she would be referring the records regarding Dr. Sterling to the medical board for a full investigation into his professional ethics. Every word from the bench felt like a final brick in the fortress I had built to protect my life. When the session ended, Clyde looked completely shattered. He realized then that he hadn't just lost the house. He had lost his reputation and was likely facing a mountain of legal trouble of his own. Elma approached me as I was gathering my things, her hand reaching out as if to offer a belated apology or a desperate plea for help. I simply raised my hand in a gentle, firm gesture to stop her. I told her I didn't hate her, but that it broke my heart to see that she had traded her mother's love for things she couldn't even keep. Clyde's parents, Mr. Porter and Lydia, were standing by the courthouse doors with their suitcases, looking pathetic and lost. They had ended their lease in anticipation of moving into my home, and now they truly had nowhere to go. It was the natural consequence of building a future on a foundation of lies. Their financial collapse was not my doing. It was the inevitable result of their own greed and their utter disregard for the rights of others. I walked out of the courthouse and took a deep, full breath of the crisp Asheville air. The snow had stopped falling, and a bright, defiant sun was starting to break through the gray clouds. Mr. Miller shook my hand in congratulations, and Marcus smiled, handing me a hot cup of coffee he'd picked up from a street vendor. He asked if it was finally over. I looked back at the stone pillars of the court and told him that yes, the drawings were finally finished and approved. As we walked down the stone steps together, I no longer felt the shadow of betrayal following me. I had reclaimed more than just my money. I had reclaimed my right to be myself, to live with independence and self-respect. Ahead of me was a warm home overlooking the lake, a desk full of new projects, and a circle of friends who saw me for who I truly was. I am Ruby Perkins, the architect of my own life, and today, my greatest work, my freedom, has officially opened under the light of justice. 6 months have passed since I walked away from my old life and the dark schemes left in its wake. Time in Asheville has always moved slowly, but here at my little condo overlooking the lake, it seems even more gentle. Today, in a space filled with golden sunlight and the warm, comforting scent of baking apple pie, I understand that I have found more than just a new place to live. I have finally found a true home. This afternoon, we are holding a small tea party on my deck. Marcus is busy helping me hang the copper wind chime that David loved so much, the one that sings whenever the mountain breeze rolls off the water. Martha and Sam are here too, bringing laughter and stories about the new community garden projects we are designing together. The thing that makes my heart truly full, however, is the sight of Maya, my granddaughter. She cycled here all by herself to visit her grandmother, carrying a hand-drawn picture she made just for me. Even though Elma and Clyde still cannot face the depth of their mistakes, Maya's pure, uncomplicated affection shows me that the seeds of goodness always survive. We share our meal without calculation or hidden agendas, enjoying a simple appreciation for one another. I realize now that family is truly composed of the people who choose to stay by your side because of who you are, not because of what you own. The story of Ruby Perkins ends here, but its message will live on. I am Casey, and I want to share something important with you. Sometimes, blood is not the only thread that binds us. When family ties are poisoned by greed, having the courage to draw a line is not an act of selfishness. It is the ultimate act of saving your own dignity. You are never a burden. You are a living treasure of experience and love. Treasure the strangers who carry the hearts of kin within them, and never be afraid to face the darkness to find your own light again. Thank you for walking this journey with Ruby and me throughout this series. How do you feel about Ruby's final choice? Is there a lesson here that changed how you view your own family? Please share your thoughts in the comments, as I would love to talk with you. Until our next story, I wish you peace and sincere companions on your journey through life.